So I want you to take a moment and think of what the general narrative is when we talk about the Revolutionary War. Well, it's pretty two-dimensional, and we often think of it as one side being the colonists, these European settlers in the Americas. On the other side, their colonial overlords, the British, and then those clash together, create a big war for independence, and out of that comes a new nation. Though part of that is true, we're going to look at that in the readings. Another important part is that colonial life is so complex and the diversity so great that that plays a central role in the narrative of the Revolutionary War as well. So we have to remember that it's not just these two players, but everyone in the region, everyone's involved, and even in Europe, people fighting on both sides, and it very much becomes an international war. And we're going to look at that in the reading this week. And we're going to look at that in the discussions. So there's three things I want to briefly touch on in this video, and that is the role of the Loyalists, Native Americans, and African Americans. And that's the untold story, the silent voices of the Revolutionary War. So we must remember that those loyal to the crown, the Loyalists, also called the Tories, were an important part of the colonial story, an important part of colonial life in the Revolutionary War. In fact, after the war, with the promise of resettling those loyal to the crown, they estimate that 1 in 40 were Loyalists, and that's near 80,000 of the people in the colonies in the new nation after the Revolutionary War were relocated to Canada, to the West Indies and the Caribbean, and also Sierra Leone. So that's an important part, and we're going to look at that story of how that shaped not only communities, but households as well, and people fighting on both sides. Often talked about when we look at the American Civil War, of families being torn apart, houses being divided. But we got to remember that that's happening in the Revolutionary War as well. Another group that's very much part of this story that we need to talk about are those that aren't fighting on either side. And remember, in Pennsylvania, religious groups like the Quakers went there with their values to not fight on any side. And so Quakers not fighting on the British or the American side, being neutral in the war, found it really hard afterwards to reintegrate into the new nation after the Revolutionary War. So you have those loyal to the crown, you have those Americans fighting for independence, and you have those neutral, trying not to be on either side and to create their own way of life as well. What about the Native Americans in this story? We've talked about the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. We've talked about the promise from the crown to create a proclamation line, a boundary for settlers not to be able to go into this territory in the Ohio Valley. And so for a lot of tribes and a lot of Native peoples, they saw their values and their land, their preservation of who they were, and they're up intact and protected by the British crown. That the real threat were the people there, which was this new nation, the Americans. So you have a lot of tribes, and you're going to read about it, fighting on the side of the British. So you have Joseph Brant, who's a Mohawk, fighting with the Iroquois and other Six Nation tribes, fighting against the American new country, and fighting them between 1776 and 79 in New York, and fighting against in Pennsylvania as well. And they're fighting against the Americans, fighting on the side of the British and seeing a better chance aligning with the British. Promises being made that that proclamation line, if after the war, when they hold the colonists back, is definitely going to be enforced and protect that Ohio Valley from colonial and American presence. So as the war continues, there's a call from Joseph Brant and other tribes fighting on the side of the British to get other tribes to take their cause and fight against the Americans. And a lot of them are up in the air. However, there's a general, John Sullivan, Major General of the American Army, who goes into the valley, goes into the region, and destroys, does a slash and burn of Native peoples and their land, even those who weren't fighting on the side of the British. But after that, most of the Six Nations fought on the side of the British because of those tactics. Also, you have people in the Ohio Valley, the Delaware tribe and the Shawnee, who weren't exactly in favor of the British, but also weren't in favor of the Americans. And so you see them sort of starting to see which side to take, which political direction would be most beneficial to them. But as fighting broke out with the colonists and taking over their lands during the war and fighting and killing them, you see them take a stronger stance in fighting with the British as well. The Cherokee is a very complex one as well. The Cherokee tribe, where they are fighting with the American colonists in Georgia and in Carolina against the British, which is a very important part of their fight in that southern colonies that you're going to read about. But the problem is they're also attacked by colonists in many different years as well. So you see them both fighting with the British, fighting against their own lands, against the Americans, and fighting against the British as well. So it's a very complex story with the Native peoples, and depending on where they are and who they can align with. But there's a large story of them being loyalists and being connected to preservation of their lands based on promises of the English crown. So like the Native Americans, African Americans played an important role of the war, and in fact they took a lot of the same stance. So in some cases they aligned themselves with the British, some cases they aligned themselves with the American forces. It depended on what the promises were and what the situation was. So a lot of them fought for the side of the British, and they fought in the infantry, they fought in the Navy. A lot of them fought as spies, being able to get information to the British as a slave in the slave household, or in a household of a plantation or a prominent member of the American forces. And the same was reverse of that. So you have spies who are fighting on the side of the Americans, giving information to them from working in the British households. So you get this amazing complex story of espionage that's playing out. But also you get these promises of freedom for individual freedoms for their families on both sides. And George Washington actually banned African Americans in the army early on. But as the war continued and the need for troops, that changed, and a lot of more forces, a lot of African Americans fought on the American side. And in fact, in some areas, more than 25%, over a quarter, fought in the Continental Army. So you have that happening. Now, so there's a complexity going on here. And even there's some stories of certain states who buy slaves from plantation owners and from other slave owners to then have them fight in the war. So on one side of it, you have the British promising for freedom. You have the American side promising for freedom. You have those who are loyal to the British, those loyalists. Even as African Americans after the war, a lot of them went to Canada. A lot of them went to Sierra Leone. Some of them, unfortunately, went to the Caribbean, the West Indies, and then they were reinstituted to slavery there, which the conditions, as we looked, was way worse. A lot of the first generation not surviving those sugar plantations, but still survived. A lot of the communities there did survive. So if you're from the Caribbean descent, might be some people who are entered there as loyalists of the British Crown, but then shortly thereafter reintroduced into slavery. So the complexity of African Americans in this story on both sides is such a rich and important story that is sadly dropped out of a lot of history books. So this week we're going to look at that a little bit further, even more diversity of the role of women in this, and then letters who are writing to their sons and their husbands who are fighting as loyalists, fighting in the American army. And together, all these complex stories really enrich our understanding of the Revolutionary War and the very foundations of the new nation.